there we are. Yes. Okay. Yes. So I've written a few things about critical realism. I'll use a bit of that first book on the left as part of what I'm going to be talking about today. The content today really is a bit more about the kind of philosophical side, I suppose you would say, of critical realism by comparison with the previous sessions, which have focused more on the research process. So these are the kind of the key critical realist concepts that underpin the approach that we take to the research process. There's quite a lot of that. The structure of this is loosely related to the background reading, which is a short piece I wrote for an encyclopedia or handbook recently. But I've had to cut out quite a lot. There's a lot of material packed into that. So I'm trying to focus on the key concepts that we have here in front of us. First, I'll have a segment where I talk a bit about causality and concepts related to that. Later, I'll move on to structure, agency, and culture. But in between, I'm going to have a short little section where I ask you what if you want to continue with online discussions of critical realism after these workshops, and what sort of form would work best for you. So that will be a short break in the content. So having said all that, let me start by saying a little bit about causality and emergence. I want to start by going back to the beginning, really. The roots of critical realism come in Bhaskara's first book, A Realist Theory of Science, and arguably the sort of fundamental argument that the whole of the critical realist enterprise is built on is his argument, what he calls this transcendental deduction from the nature of science, which is intended as a kind of contribution to philosophy of science originally. As we'll see later on, then this becomes very relevant to social science too, but he starts off with science in general. And the general trend of philosophy of science in the second half of the 20th century was to criticize a kind of positivist image of science as a process which accumulated more and more true laws. And the sort of main thrust of 20th century philosophy of science was to cast doubt on the reliability of scientific knowledge. But Bhaskara, although he's also engaged in the critique of this positive tradition, takes a different tack, and he says, well, what if we accept that there's something right about positivism, which is that actually science is useful. Science provides us with useful knowledge. He obviously he accepts that scientific knowledge is still questionable, and it's hard to see how anyone could deny that, given that scientific knowledge sometimes is changed by scientists themselves. But despite that, science provides us with useful knowledge. So what are the implications of that, he says, for the way that the world works? And in particular, he's developing this argument as a critique of the work of David Hume, who's a 17th century philosopher whose work influenced the whole positivist tradition. And Hume was an empiricist. He believed that the only knowledge we could obtain was obtained through our senses. And he argued that this means that causality is really just an association that we make between two sets of events that are constantly related to each other, in the sense that we have a set of events that let's call them type A, and another set of events let's call them events of type B, and in our experience, we find that events of type A are always followed by events of type B. So, for example, event of type A might be pressing a light switch, and event of type B might be the lights coming on. So Hume says, well, all causality is that we know that every time we have an event of type A, an event of type B follows. That's what Pascal calls a constant conjunction of events, and he calls this perspective regularity determinism. There's a regular relationship. A determines B. Now, Pascal says, well, if we look at laboratory science, then that sort of perspective just doesn't make sense. How does laboratory science work? Well, it works through scientists isolating particular phenomena that they're interested in from outside influences. So the Large Hadron Collider, for example, is buried underneath a mountain so that radiation from outside the experiment isn't able to interfere with the results of the experiment. And that's the classic sort of thing that happens in experimental science. The scientists create what's known as a closed system, a set of conditions where outside influences are excluded so that they don't interfere with the things they're trying to study. Well, Pascal says, if that's the case, then Hume's version of causality doesn't make sense anymore, because it's quite clear that scientists understand that this relationship between A and B can be interfered with by other forces. It isn't a constant conjunction, or they wouldn't need laboratories to create closed systems in the first place. And then the second aspect of his argument is that scientists do these experiments in these artificially closed systems. They come to conclusions about causality on the basis of them, and then they believe that those conclusions are of some value in understanding what happens in the real world, where systems aren't closed. In open systems where lots of other factors can influence an event, even though they know that those other factors can interfere with the results. So that implies that the scientists too know that these causal relationships aren't constant conjunctions, that there's something useful happening, something causal happening, even when the constant conjunction doesn't take place, even when the things being studied is then moved out into the outside world. So Pascal says, well, he makes what he calls a transcendental deduction. So that's a concept that comes from Kant, and the idea is that you take some uncontroversial claim and you look at the necessary conditions for that. So you're saying if the claim is true, then the conditions must also be true. And Pascal says, well, the uncontroversial claim is that laboratory science makes sense, it's intelligible as an activity, and therefore the conditions that make it intelligible must be true, and the condition that makes it intelligible to do the things that scientists do is that the way causality works is that lots of different factors interact with each other. Some factors can tend to produce a certain result, but there's no guarantee that they will. So events are multiply determined. They're the outcome of many interacting factors, and those factors act as tendencies. So they tend to bring about a certain outcome, but that outcome is not guaranteed because it can be interrupted, frustrated by other interacting factors. And there's a word there I haven't used yet, and that word is powers. So let's go on then to say a bit more about how he fills out that account of causality. So he argues then that these causal factors are powers of things. I tend to call them entities, but he calls them things. So events are caused by multiple interacting causal powers, tendencies. We've done that already. And he then links that up with the theory of emergence. So the sense, emergence is used in a variety of ways, but the sense that he's using is that things have emergent properties when those properties or powers, as he's using the term, are properties that the whole thing possesses, which the parts of the thing don't possess unless they're organized into this kind of whole. Now, I know that's a bit abstract, so I like to illustrate it with the concept of a dog being able to bark. So dogs have a power to bark. That's an emergent property of a dog. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean that, you know, if we look at how a dog is able to bark, we can see that the various parts of the dog, the lungs, windpipe, vocal cords, mouth, brain, and those various parts have to interact in a certain way for the dog to be able to bark. And so we can explain the dog's capacity to bark in terms of the sort of lower level parts, but the lower level parts still wouldn't have that capacity if they weren't organized into that whole thing, that dog in this case. And so the causal power is a power of the whole dog. It's not a power of the parts. Now that might seem like a trivial argument, but it's an argument that is important when we're dealing with a tendency in the philosophy of causality known as reductionism. So reductionists say, no, the wholes don't have powers. It's all down to the influence of the parts. And of course, we have a nice example of that in the social sciences, which is known as methodological individualism, which I guess many people have come across. And so methodological individualists apply this sort of argument to the reductionist argument to the idea that social structures can be causal. And they say, you know, so a realist might say, well, you know, that social structure has had an effect, you know, the government has had an effect on this thing, and the individualists will say, no, it wasn't the social structure, there's no such thing, really, it was just the effect of lots of people interacting with each other. And the realist response is to say, well, yes, those people interacted with each other, that brought about the result, but they were only able to interact with each other because they were parts of this larger thing, the government or whatever the social structure is that we are employing in our explanation. And they wouldn't have had the capacity to interact that way and have the net result that they did if they hadn't been parts of that larger thing. So this power that we're trying to explain is an emergent property of the social structure concerned. So that links up to another piece of terminology that is often used in this context, and including by Bhaskar, which is the notion of a generative mechanism. Now, Bhaskar tends to use generative mechanism and causal power interchangeably, but I think it makes more sense to see them as close related but slightly different concepts. So mechanisms, I think we can think of as being processes of interaction between different things. A generative mechanism is most useful to think of as the process of interaction between the parts of a thing that produces a particular causal power. So that the power is produced by the mechanism. They're very tightly related, but they're slightly different concepts. So we saw that in the case of the dog. The dog has a power to bark. The mechanism is a process of interaction between the various body parts that we talked about. That means that we can, as I said this already, we can explain how the power works, but that doesn't explain it away because, as we've said, the power only exists when we have the whole dog, which enables the interaction process to take place. Okay, so that's all I want to say about causality. and emergence, but I do want to link that briefly to explanation. So if causality works in the way that we've talked about, then really we need to think of two different parts of a causal explanation. You know, if causality is a process in which multiple things with powers interact, then to explain any individual event, we need to retrodict it. It's the retrodiction at the bottom of this slide, which means to say, well, what are all the different powers that were involved in producing this event? Or perhaps a class of similar events might be retrodicted in a similar way. But retrodiction itself depends on also having done reproduction. So reproduction is to explain individual powers and the mechanisms that produce them. So when I talked about the dog and how the dog's power to bark was produced, that was a case of reproduction. You know, here's a power, here's a mechanism that underpins the power. But if we want to explain some particular event in which a dog barks, then that's only one part of the explanation. We probably also have to say, well, what else happened that prompted the dog to bark? And then no doubt a bunch of other factors might be involved in that. So retrodiction is about the many different factors that are involved in producing one event. Retrodiction is about explaining each of those factors, each of those powers, and how it operates. Inevitably, when you say retrodiction in this context, someone asks the question, how does that relate to abduction? I think it's fair to say that these terms are not used entirely consistently across the whole of critical realism. I struggle a bit with the concept of abduction. Abduction seems to be a kind of form of reasoning, like induction or deduction. And the best account I've seen is that it's a kind of reasoning in which we kind of abstract from a particular to what lies behind it. I mean, one example of that would be retroduction, to say, well, what lies behind this particular power, but perhaps it can be done in other contexts as well. So interpretive social scientists might look at an action and then abstract from that to think about the meaning that lies behind it. So retroduction seems like a special case of abduction. However, I'm aware that not everyone thinks of abduction and retroduction in those terms. So that is sometimes a source of confusion. Okay, so now I want to move on to talk about structure, agency, and culture for the rest of the session. And in a way, what we're doing here is we're looking at how we can apply Bhaskara's idea about causality and emergence to the social world. And I want to talk a bit about Margaret Archer's approach to structure, a bit about her approach to agency, a bit about some other angles on structure, which relate partly to my work, and briefly a little bit about culture. Now, I'll try and keep that moving along because I have got a lot to say. So let's begin with Margaret Archer's approach to social structure. Just one more thing. No, I can't. So generally what I'm looking at here then is the question of whether we can apply something like Bhaskara's model of causal powers to the social world. And if we're going to do that, then the questions that follow are what kinds of things, with what sorts of causal powers arising from what sorts of mechanisms might interact to produce social events. And broadly speaking, there are sort of three kinds of answers as to what sorts of things might interact to produce social events. The first one is just people. Methodological individualists will be happy with that. People interact to produce social events, but we're not rejecting the idea that people have a causal influence. In fact, people are agents, as they're often known in the social sciences, are a key element in producing social events. Material objects too, they perhaps got neglected in the social sciences for a long time. Reactor network theorists have encouraged us to bring them back, quite rightly, because clearly material objects have an influence on what happens in the social world too. And then thirdly, we have social structures. So social structures are arguably the most contentious of these, because as we've seen, some people deny that they can have influence. And we're going to look at Archer's approach and a little bit more about mine, which is arguably a bit closer to the kind of formulation of Ascot ideas I've given you to now. Okay, so Archer's approach, she calls the morphogenetic approach. So morphogenesis comes from an old, two words from old languages, Greek or Latin, who knows? Maybe one of you knows, I don't. Morpho means shape or form, and genesis means creation. So morphogenetic processes are processes which tend to elaborate a system's form, structure, or state. So processes that change the state of something, morphogenesis. And there's a complementary concept, morphostasis, which Archer also uses, which means processes which tend to stabilize or sustain the system's form or state. So morphogenesis is about change, and morphostasis is about stability. And she calls the kind of relationship, the kind of interactive relationship between structures, social structures, and agents, individual people, she calls it a morphogenetic cycle. So she has a cyclical explanation of how structures and agents relate to each other over time, which is usually represented in this diagram here. So this is from her realist social theory. And in this diagram, we have time flowing across from the left to the right. So T1 is time 1, time 2, 3, 4. And so this is a kind of abstract representation of what happens in a relationship between structure and agency. And she says, well, whenever someone acts, they're always acting in a pre-existing context. So T1, there is a context, and in particular, she's focused here on pre-existing social structures. So at T2, the agent is making a decision about what to do. And Archer thinks about agency very much in terms of decision making. She sees agents as consciously deliberating on their action, and structure that enters into the story because the agent is conscious of some aspects, at least of their structural context, and their awareness of their structural context affects how they act. So I mentioned governments earlier, people are aware of the existence and powers of governments, and that affects what they do. So or what else? Power structures, racism, sexism, people are aware of power structures around things like that, and that affects what they do. So they make a decision at T2, time 2, to act. That is partly shaped by their understanding of the structures in which they're embedded. And then act, that's this interaction phrase in the middle, and that action has results, which we get at time 3. And those results feed back into the state of the structural context. So obviously, if one person acts, that doesn't usually have much impact on its own on the structural context, but when many people act, these actions collectively can change the structural context. That's structural elaboration, the third phase of this process. And the outcome of that is that at time 4, we have a new structural context. Now that new structural context might just be the same as the old structural context. Say, people who act in a way which just preserves the old structural context, doesn't threaten anything, then that leads to reproduction of structures, which of course matches the morphostasis version of the concept. Or sometimes people act in such a way that changes the context. And that is transformation, structural transformation or morphogenesis. I see a question from Stephen. I can see your Q&As, by the way, but I can't see your chat for some reason. Stephen said, presumably the agents don't have to be aware of the structures to be affected by them. That's a very good point. I'll come back to that quite soon. But before I do that, let me go back to my previous slide and just finish off a couple of things there. So I guess the first thing to say really is that this model of the relationship between structure and agency is very similar to a model that Bhaskar outlines in his second book, The Possibility of Naturalism, which he called the transformational model of social action. And the two were developed in parallel. I don't think either of them was aware of each other's work at the time that they developed those, but then they subsequently found that they were very close. So the TMSA is expressed in a different way, but it says something really quite similar. Okay, I think that's probably what we need there. That does leave a bit of an open question, of course, and that open question is, well, what form do these structures take in the first place? And Archer has an answer to that as well, and here she invokes the concept of emergent properties, just as Bhaskar does, and says that emergent properties are properties that would depend on a lower level, but can act back on it. So you can see that's fairly similar to the way we've talked about emergence already. And here's a quote from Archer that expresses that too. And she talks about emergent properties in 3 different areas. So she's very keen on the relationship between structure, agency, and culture. So she talks about structural emergent properties. So structures have emergent properties, which are the ones that people were aware of in that morphogenetic cycle. People themselves have emergent properties. So here's that point that people, agents, are also causally effective. And she also talks about cultural emergent properties, which we'll come back to her kind of culture in a while. Okay, and I'll answer some of your questions as I go along here. So Priya has also said when a new program is introduced or a new educational approach, in which we get a return to a traditional approach. So Brexit, okay, so Brexit kind of undoes structural change in a way, doesn't it? Is that morphostasis, Priya says? Well, that's a very good question. I mean, it's a bit of both, really, isn't it? So Brexit is an example of morphogenesis because it's changed the structural context. But from a longer term perspective, it's undone some change. So I guess you could think of it as a kind of morphostasis, although it's more of a kind of regressive morphogenesis, perhaps. Yes, culture different from the structure, Priya asked. Yes, yeah, we'll come to that. I tend to agree with you on that, but again, we'll come to that when we talk about content. Okay, let's continue then. So I think that's enough on Archer's view of structure. So let's say a little bit about Archer's view on agency. So we've said already that Margaret Archer thinks of people as also being active causal powers or having active causal powers in the determination of social events, and we see that in that cyclical interaction of structure and agency, but also in more specific cases. Usually in social theory, we use the word agency to refer to people's impacts on events. Archer doesn't usually use the word agency. She used the word agency to mean something different in her earlier work, and so she usually talks about reflexivity instead. So the heart of Archer's account of agency is that people are reflexive in the sense that we've already stressed that they actually think consciously about their actions and make decisions about what to do. And we'll contrast that in a moment to the point that Stephen made in the Q&A, which is that arguably structure might shape us in our actions in less reflexive ways. And Archer's quite opposed to that sort of theory. So she doesn't like the work of Bourdieu, for example, because Bourdieu says that the structures kind of what's the word, they kind of almost become part of us and determine how we act without us being able to think about it. Archer rejects that sort of perspective, although, as we'll see in a minute, some critical realists don't. And stresses this capacity that we have to consider ourselves in relation to our context. Now, that's what she calls reflexivity, and she thinks that it takes part in, yes, in a kind of large context. So she doesn't just think about us thinking of our actions like one at a time. I think this is very valuable. She says that, well, actually, we think about bigger things than just what we're doing right now. We make decisions about what sort of person we are, and we make decisions about what matters to us. We are who we are, she says, because of what we care about. When we think and decide about what things we care about, we're defining the sort of person that we are. And we also want to think about, well, what do we want to do as a result of what we care about? So big decisions like, what career are we going to engage in? What subjects are we going to study? What social movements are we going to take part in? Or what hobbies are we going for? This sort of longer term decisions where we translate the things that we care about into particular projects. And in our smaller actions then take place within this context of this consciously determined identity. And she says that we think about these things through what she calls internal conversations. It's a concept that comes from the pragmatist George Herbert Mead. And in these internal conversations, she says, we take account of our emotions. And she thinks of our emotions as something which, not something that we kind of consciously control, but something which subconsciously emerge in response to the things that we care about and express our deeper concerns. And she thinks that we talk to ourselves, in a sense, about what we care about and what the implications of that should be. And that then affects the actions that we take. Now, here's the question that Stephen was raising earlier. I think this does mean that she neglects other ways in which social structures affect us, because social structures can also, and Bourdieu talks about this through the concept of habitus, they can also affect who we are in a kind of pre-reflective sense. So Bourdieu talks about, for example, the culture that we grow up in affecting us because we just imitate it, we absorb it unthinkingly, and reproduce it unthinkingly. And that's a nice example is accent. You know, if you grew up in a particular community, sort of language, a particular accent, then without really thinking about it, deciding to do it, people speak in the same way. I'm told my internet is unstable, by the way. Send me a message if that's a problem. And so that's an element of structural concept. Sometimes, for example, accent reflects class, and that's quite common in England. People's accents reflect their class background, that you might grow up in one area, have a middle class accent, or grow up in the same area and have a working class accent. And so things about your social context enter into the person that you are and affect the way that you act. And just something that perhaps relatively simple, like accent, but your expectations about life, not uncommon for people from a poorer background to be less ambitious because they don't expect to be able to, have more exciting careers or aspire to more senior opportunities. So that's an example of your structure infiltrating the person that you are and shaping your actions in a way that you're not necessarily aware of and isn't about conscious decision making. Now, I think, and I've written about this, that we can have both. Archer doesn't think we can have both. Archer thinks agency is all about making decisions. Bourdieu pretty much neglects making decisions, and I think she's right to criticize him for that, and he tends to see our actions as essentially determined by our structural context, whereas I think we can have both. We can recognize that people are affected by their structural background, their habitus, in unthinking ways, but also that they make decisions and that those two things interact in determining how we behave. Okay, now she also talks about different modes of reflexivity. I think I may just skip over that. Well, perhaps I won't, because I think there's a little bit of opportunity for you to interact with me here. So let's just do that quickly. So Archer says, well, yes, we talk to ourselves about what decisions we're going to make, but she says that different people do it in different ways, and she calls these modes of reflexivity. She says there are communicative reflexives, who are people that won't make decisions without talking to those around them, friends, family, and so on. And so they're more influenced, if you like, by their community. Then there are autonomous reflexives. Those are people who make decisions themselves and tend to be quite self-interested about those decisions. So they perhaps fit better with the kind of rational choice concept of how we behave. And then she says we have meta-reflexives, who are people who make decisions themselves, but reflect much more on the context and the implications of their decisions, and not just on the self-interest side of things. And she has a fourth category, which is people who haven't really developed a coherent approach yet, which she calls fractured reflexives. So this is based on an empirical study, and she thinks that structural change is kind of encouraging, pushing people away from the communicative style, which is sort of associated with kind of traditional membership of a community, and towards being more independent in their decision making, so towards autonomous and meta reflexivity. Okay, I was going to ask you to think about this for yourself, but perhaps I will push on. Yes, perhaps it's something you could think about, and we can talk about later on. What sort of reflexive do you think that you are? We'll perhaps come back to that at the end of the time scale later on. Okay, so that's Archer on structural agency. Let me go a little bit quicker and talk about kind of complementary approach to social structure. So this is the idea that social structures are things. We don't really get that in Archer. We get this interaction between agency and structure. We get the idea that there are emergent properties, but you didn't really clearly identify those emergent properties with specific things. So to that extent, you're not quite tying up with Bhaskara's approach, as I understand it. Because I tried to make those connections tighter. So from my perspective, social structures are social things. They're composed of things composed of people, and sometimes of other material things as well. So let's just illustrate that first of all. So a queue, that's queue, I think, is a very simple kind of social structure. It's an entity with parts. The parts are the people who make up the queue. They're related to each other in a particular way. They stand in a line, or they're ordered at any rate in some way. Not all queues are physical these days. And queues have a causal power, which is the capacity to serialize access to a resource. I don't even know what these people are queuing for in this picture. Maybe it's we can get into a sale or something of the sort, but the point is that the queuing means that their access to that resource they're queuing for, can be the order in which they access it can be sorted out in a relatively peaceful way. And they work because all of these queues share a certain structural basis. They're composed of people, they're ordered by the position in the queue, and the whole operation of the queue depends on the fact that those people share a set of norms about what's involved in queuing. So you get the people, the order, the norms. That gives us a structure with a causal background. Okay, so that's a simple version of a social entity. Organizations are another more complex case. An organization is a group of people with a structure that depends on the roles that people assume within the organization. And those roles in turn depend on norms. Again, that would be a bit of a common theme. Norms influenced the structure of the queue. Norms about what roles people occupy and what's involved in performing that role are what structures an organization. Once people have got their roles, they interact in certain ways, and the consequence is that the organization as a whole has some causal influence on the world that it wouldn't have if the members of the organization weren't interacting in that way. Okay, I very, very briefly mention another type of structure which is called norm circles. This is something I introduced. And norm circles are an attempt to explain how normativity itself works, and we've seen that normativity underpins some other kinds of social structure. I think we all know what a norm is. It's a set of expectations about how people should behave. And my argument is that for every norm, there is a group of people that endorse and enforce that norm. And because we're aware of such groups of people and the consequences that face us, if we fail to observe a norm, then we tend to observe those norms where we're exposed to the actions of people who back the norm. So let's go back to queuing. Say those people are queuing for access to a cash machine. We want access to the cash machine. We just ignore the queue and go straight to the front. Now, what's going to happen is that people in the queue are going to complain. They're going to say, "Oh, there's a queue here. Get to the back." And as we're exposed to those sorts of pressures, then we start to understand the norm and generally start to comply with it. So this causal power to have people conform with norms arises, I'm suggesting, from the existence of these kind of hidden social structures, which I call norm circles. There's lots more that could be said about norm circles, but I want to leave a bit of time for us to ask questions and discuss questions. So I'm going to move on from norms, although they will be relevant to the conversation about culture too. So let's quickly talk about culture. As I think Priya said, it's not immediately apparent what the distinction between structure and culture is. Archer thinks that it is apparent. Archer thinks that culture is composed of propositions. So culture can have different meanings, and we'll see a different view of culture in a moment. But for Archer, when she talks about culture, she's talking about ideas and propositions. A proposition is just, a statement of an idea. And she says, well, propositions are recorded in material things beyond individuals. Books. So here she is holding a book in her hand. So a book is an example of what she calls intelligibilia. Intelligibilia is a plural. It means things that we can make sense of. And so books are an example of intelligibilia. Social media posts, movies, hundreds of examples, different forms in which propositional culture can be recorded. And she says that there's a second morphogenetic cycle. So the first morphogenetic cycle was where structures influence people's actions, which then reproduce or transform structures. Well, she says that the same thing happens in this space of propositional culture. She doesn't talk about propositional culture, she just talks about culture, but I'm kind of distinguishing it. And she says that there's a kind of cultural system that pre-exists any given action, and then people interact in a cultural kind of way. Perhaps they produce new intelligibilia, or perhaps they just interact verbally. And the consequence of this socio-cultural interaction is to either reproduce or transform the existing cultural system. So that means that we see the same kind of cycle, that the sort of higher level thing which is being reproduced or transformed, in this case of the cultural system instead of social structure, but the process otherwise is similar. Now, I think this idea of propositional culture as affecting our actions is really useful and interesting, but I have some real doubts about the ontology of the way she does this. And there's a debate that we've been involved in, which you can read and you can see why I disagree with that. But rather than talking about that, let's talk about a different way of thinking about culture, which is that we can also think about culture as as shared practices. How do we act in our relationships with each other? How do we, so when we meet, what do we do? Do we shake hands? Do we kiss each other on the cheek? Probably not in these post-COVID days. Do we fist bump? Do we bow and curtsy? Well, it depends on the cultural context, doesn't it? And these cultural practices also extend to things like language. How do we express an idea? What word do we use? What sounds do we make? How do we put those words together into sentences? So we have kind of linguistic culture, and so on. So this is quite a different sense of culture than archers. They're both valid concepts of culture. They're both socially significant. But if you look at this kind of culture, then I think this brings us back to Priya's point. What's different about culture and structure? Because really, if we think that normative structures are structures, well, normative structures are also shaping culture and the behaviors that we employ when we interact with each other. Archer's example is arguably something that might be determined differently, but that's one of the things I disagree with her about. Okay, so I think that is probably the last thing that I want to say before we start talking about your questions. So here's just a bit of a summing up of what I said in this session. So first of all, the critical realist model of causality can be applied to the social world, and the ways in which various critical realists have done it is to think of things like structures and agents, as well as material objects, as being causally effective because they are things with emergent powers. And then we've looked a little bit more at the details of some particular kinds of things that might operate in the social world. Again, we've seen that there are conflicting but reconcilable differences of opinion on agents. Are we? I think there's an agreement that we are beings with emergent properties and powers, and then the question is, how are we influenced by structure? And for Archer, it's about consciously taking account of its existence, and of course that happens. But for some of us, something like Bourdieu's argument that structures also kind of seep into us and affect us without us being fully aware of that, is also a way in which we can see that relationship between structure and agent taking place. And culture is perhaps a little different, but perhaps not. Yeah, those are some of the sources that are used and referred to. These slides will be available on the webpage, so you can look that up if you want to. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and give you a chance to talk about these questions and ask questions yourself. So I'm afraid that I haven't been able to follow your questions in the chats because they all disappeared when I got to my presentation and I couldn't see them again.
Would it be helpful if I read them out or anything like that? Like we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 on the Q&A.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to pick up the ones in the Q&A, and then perhaps if anybody has anything that they raised in the chat that they still want to address, then perhaps you could put it in the Q&A as well. So I can only you can have all the questions in one place. That makes it a bit easier, I think.
Mm.
Okay, so I have said a bit about some of these already. So do feel free to ask more questions. So the first one I have on my list is from Priya. This was a Brexit question. When a new program is introduced? What if the progress is of regression? Is that morphostasis? And I think, as I said before, it's in a way it's both morphostasis and morphogenesis. The net result, after the whole Brexit process was that there was structural change. There's no doubt about that. From a situation in which the UK was part of the European community, we ended up in a situation in which it wasn't. So that's, I would think of that primarily as morphogenesis, but I can see a good argument for saying that there is an element of morphostasis and returning back to what we had before. Okay, then Stephen's question, I think I've also answered. Presumably agents don't have to be aware of structures to be affected by them, and that's at the heart of the sort of the discussions between Archer with her view that structure affects us because we think about it consciously, and the sort of argument that we find in Bourdieu, which people like Andrew say have said, well, yes, that's also a good argument, that structure can influence us without us fully being aware of it. Okay, then we have some new ones. So from Priya, we have, perhaps I should give you the opportunity to raise these questions yourselves. Priya, would you like to say anything yourself about your question?
Oh, sorry, Dave, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Are you reading out my question?
Yes, so you have a question about internal conversation. Did you want to ask that or say anything more about it?
Yes, so we are doing a phenomenological study of one of the educational approaches in a medical program, and we were wondering that can internal conversation be legitimately called as a part of a methodology? Because that's how we actually came upon to that particular approach as we were trying to unpack the underlying mechanisms and the structure and agency interplay. So can that be legitimately a methodology or a method?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, the way I'm reading your question, and forgive me if I got this wrong, is that it seems a bit like what's often called autoethnography. So auto in the sense of self. So autoethnography means describing your own experience of something, and that in sociology these days is often thought of as a legitimate research method. And I suppose internal conversation is kind of like that, but it's looking at your own reflections on something. And there's lots of angles that this could be taken. So let me just take one of them, and that is to say that I think all research involves kind of imaginative leaps. If you're going to go from observing the world to making some sort of argument which isn't just a description of what you've seen, if you're going to reproduce, for example, by saying, well, I think there's a causal mechanism at work here, and I think this is how it works, then there's a bit of an imaginative leap involved in getting from the facts to your theory about what's lying behind the facts. And perhaps that's a kind of internal conversation as well, and it's an important part of the research process. But maybe I have misinterpreted. Does either of those answers fit with what you were thinking?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thanks. Then I have a couple of questions from Rina. Did you want to say anything, Rina, about your questions?
Hi, thanks very much for the input. I can't imagine how structure can be ignored and cannot have a profound influence on the outcome of a person's life. When you look at poor rural South Africa, it's very difficult not to take structure into account. I mean, is that possible, is what I'm really asking.
Yes. I think that there are very few people who deny that structure sort of exists in some sense. But methodological individualists tend to say, well, all those things that we think of as structures, they're just kind of our way of making sense of the interactions that we have with other individual people. So they would say that, I mean, I find it hard to explain the point of view because I agree with you. I don't think that it really makes a lot of sense. But in the abstract, these people will say that when you say, for example, that you know, the structure of wealth distribution has a causal influence, then they will say, well, no, this is just about, you know, relationships between individuals, and you know, while it may seem like it's a structural influence, once we get down to explaining how it works, it's really just people interacting with each other, and all the causal power is with the people. I find that incomprehensible. I mean, if you look at, I mean, I know a more striking example was the system of apartheid in South Africa, wasn't it? You know, utterly determinative of, you know, huge aspects of people's lives, and difficult to see that for me in any other sense than as a structural set of influences. So, yeah, I kind of share your your skepticism as to the possibility of having an
I
understanding.
mean, even post-apartheid, the people.
I have a couple other people asking questions.
Even post-apartheid.
Sorry, Rina. I think you're saying something, but it's not getting through to me.
Sorry, my internet's unstable.
Okay, let me move on then to a couple of others. So Stephen, did you want to ask your question?
Yep, sure. It's probably a little bit confusing, but I was interested, just going back to your example of a queue, Dave, but I think you could apply this to any other idea as well, is should we see this queue? It's obviously a real thing, you can see it, but it's also a concept as well. The queue is a concept. And I think from a critical realist perspective, you could approach it either from the angle of it being an idea or as a real entity. And it feels like there's a choice there that you could make within CR. So is CR any help in kind of navigating this idea of should you see things as concepts or should you see things as simply a manifestation of reality?
Okay, thank you. Lots of interesting things there. Yeah, cues are interesting in a number of ways. They're kind of very untypical of social structures in one sense, and that sense is that you can see them. I mean, a methodological individualist would say, oh, you can't see a queue, you can just see some people. But of course we can see a queue because we understand how it is that those people have structured themselves. Because we share an idea of what a queue is. So I think the queue is a real entity. It's a real entity whose existence is concept dependent. So that's one of the things that one of the things that Bastos says about social structure in his book, The Possibility of Naturalism. He says that social structures are concept dependent, and of course the existence of the queue is concept dependent. It only works because we understand what a queue is. And because we understand what a queue is, and we understand the kind of expectations that other people have around queuing, then queues work. So there's a very tight relationship between the idea and the entity. You have to have both. The idea of a Q would be kind of pretty useless and meaningless if we didn't actually have Qs as real entities, but equally the Q as a real entity cannot work without the idea of the Q. Kind of in the heads of the people who are queuing and in the heads of the people who are making decisions around the queue. Does that help?
It does help, but I suppose it leads to the follow-up question of if you could see them as both, as a real thing, or as a kind of a concept. Does CR, critical realism, does it guide that choice? I mean, which one takes priority in that they're both involved, or is it another structure and agent question where it's both?
I mean, I think it is both. I mean, for me, the thing that takes priority is the fact that there is a real thing there, which is a Q, which has causal powers, but we can't avoid recognizing that the Q depends on how we think about it, and that's true, by the way, of all social structures. That organizations depend on the ways in which we think about them, on the idea of the organization that we have. But for me, it's there is a real thing there composed of real people. One of the other interesting angles, I think, is that in most social structures, we kind of lose the thing that makes cues visible, which is that most structures in the natural world depend for their structures on a kind of spatial relationships between the parts. So a bicycle, for example, if we can call that the natural world, material world, not natural world. A bicycle has a structure that depends on its parts being in certain relations to each other. A dog has a structure that depends on its parts being in a certain relation to each other spatially, whereas an organization only depends on the kind of ideational relationships between the people who are part of it. Q is still a bit spatial, but something like, I don't know, a trade union, for example, the people who are parts of the trade union aren't necessarily in any particular spatial relationship to each other. It's just the whole thing exists as a consequence of the ideas that the people in the organization have about their relationships with each other. So the ideas are crucial, but for me, it's the entity that is the important thing from a causal perspective. I also see a question from Nock. Do you want to ask your question, Nock?
Thank you, Dave. So I think my question kind of continuing from Rina. Like, for example, like in a country with a strong culture and maybe like cultural belief or kind of authoritarian political structure, like a lot of countries in the global south, how does social change happen? Like when structural change is almost impossible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think clearly some societies are more open to structural change than others. Interesting. I can't say that I'm familiar with all the details, but in her recent work, Archer has talked about kind of what she calls morphogenic society, which is the kind of society where change becomes the norm, if you like. And she talks about how sort of contemporary societies are, or at least sort of Western contemporary societies are moving in that direction. Whereas traditional societies tend to be much less open to change. Yeah, I guess for good reasons, and depended on certain ways of working to get by for a very long time. But how can you introduce change into those countries? How is change introduced into those sorts of contexts? And I guess that for me, there are a couple of things that affect change. One is changing circumstances, and the other is people's awareness of kind of incoherence, if you like. So when the circumstances change, then people have to adapt to new things. So technology, for example, modern technology or ultra modern technology, smartphones are penetrating the world. They introduce all sorts of new things. Maybe they come in because they're a good way to keep in touch with their family when people have migrated to the cities or to other countries. But then they bring in contact with other ideas or other possibilities of doing things differently. So those sorts of things spark change. And then the other issue is coherence. That I think a lot of change arises because people see conflicts. You say, well, traditionally we're told that we should do things this way, but actually there's an opportunity to do something different. Why do we still have to keep doing things the old way when there's some benefits to doing things this new way? So the conflicts and conflicts between different normative standards. So this goes back to my norm circles point. So people are often exposed in a traditional society. There's a bit of what Mark Archer calls cultural integration. Everybody knows the rules. Everybody lives by pretty much the same rules, subject to variation depending on their social status. And there's quite an element of stability there, but increasingly what we're seeing is normative diversity. So Archer says, well, even historically, really nowhere was completely culturally integrated. There was always variation, different rules for different people, and increasingly people are being exposed to different norms from different groups that they're involved in. You make one set of norms from your family, one set of norms that you're exposed to when you go to school or to work, and people see conflicts between those, and they have to try and work out, well, how do we deal with those differences? And that, I think, tends to spark change as well. That's quite abstract, though, and applying it to particular cases demands much more empirical knowledge. Okay, I still see two more cases. There's another one from Rena, but Bata hasn't asked one before. Perhaps I could ask Bata to ask your question.
Yeah, I was just considering, could it be that evolutionary theory or natural selection is the underlying causal power of structures?
Interesting. I mean, I wouldn't think of it as, okay, so I think here there's a difference between two different kinds of explanation, which I've talked about as a distinction between synchronic and diachronic explanation. So when I'm talking about the mechanisms that produce the power of a thing, we're talking about something synchronic. So synchronic means happening in the moment, happening at a particular time. So the capacity of a dog to bark depends on what parts it has now and how they're related to each other now. Okay, the actual process of barking takes a little bit of time, but in the very short term, the causal power of the dog depends on what it has right now. The evolutionary theory is about diachronic change. So diachronic means over a period of time. So evolutionary theory might explain how something came to be the way that it is. So evolutionary theory certainly has a major part to play in explaining how it is the dog came to have the structure that it does. but it doesn't explain the actual mechanism that's operating now. It explains how it came about, but doesn't explain how it actually works at the time concerned. So evolutionary theory certainly has a role. Now, I've talked about it having a role in explaining how a natural structure like a dog might work. Does it have a role in explaining social structures? That's an interesting question. I'm a little bit dubious about evolutionary social theory. It's a kind of interesting analogy, but I think that it's missing the fundamental mechanism, the whole thing about DNA that underpins evolutionary theory in the natural world. So I don't think it has quite such kind of powerful leverage in making sense of social change as evolutionary theory does in the natural world.
Great, should we close it there then? So yeah, I guess all is to say for me as the host is thank you for everyone for attending. Those of you who've stayed to the end, I hope you found it useful. And a huge thank you to Dave for putting this together and for delivering the webinar this morning. I say this morning for our time, but the seminar today. So thanks everyone, and hopefully see you again at the next one.
Great. Thanks, Gareth.
Bye everyone.